Thank you everyone for joining. This is Genesis to Exodus, From Family to Nation with Rabbi David Silber. This class is a continuation of Rabbi David Silber's previous classes on Bereshit that have been going on for Sunday mornings for the past couple of years. In this series, the construction of the family of Israel takes place in the concluding chapters of Genesis, while the book of Exodus is about the formation of the nation. These sessions will focus on nation building in Exodus and the relation of family and nation as reflected in the first several chapters of Exodus. For those who are tuning in for the first time, this is Rabbi David Silber. He is the longtime dean of Drisha. And if you're tuning in on Zoom and Facebook Live, your questions are very welcome. Please always feel welcome to ask questions in chat. I will bring them to Rabbi Silber's attention. If you're also tuning in on Zoom, I'm sending out invitations to panelists. That way you can unmute yourself, ask questions more directly, chime in, and that's great. I strongly recommend doing it. It makes for a better Beit Midrash experience. But even if you can't, just ask in chat or use the raise your hand function, and I'll bring your classes forward. All I ask is, if you are not actively speaking, to please mute yourself. And with that, I want to turn things over to Rabbi Silber.
Okay, thank you, Kayla. Okay, the plan is to try to finish Bereshit this morning. Not that you ever really fully finish it, but so the story is the brothers have returned from burying their father Yaakov, in the middle of chapter 50. As we started last week, in the 14th pasuk, this is Vayoshav Yosef Mitzrayim hu v'yachav v'chol ha'olim ito l'kporat aviv. So in verse number 14, you see straight out that the focus is going to be on Yosef. Yosef returns with his brothers. They're secondary. They're important as well. And all that went up with him. In other words, the description of the funeral, the burial, Mitzrayim was pretty central there. But here Mitzrayim drops off, and it's Yosef and his brothers. And after Kavro et Aviv, it doesn't say after Kavro et Avihem, after they buried their father, but rather after he buried his father. So now that's very important for the continuation of the story. So in the 15th pasuk it says, Vayiru achei Yosef ki meit avihem. The brothers saw. Of course, they saw it. It means they experienced it. They recognized the significance of it. Rashi has a medrash. They felt that Yosef is much cooler to them at this point, not as welcoming after their father had died. And Vayomru lu yistamenu Yosef, and their concern is that perhaps Yosef will hate us, yistamenu. As we pointed out at the end of last week's session, the word listom appears in two other places in Bereshit, but one of them is with Esav. After Yaakov took the blessings that were supposed to be given to Esav, it says Vayistom Esav et Yaakov, that Esav hated Yaakov, and he said, after my father dies, I will kill my brother. And over here we have exactly that scenario. Yaakov has died, and now the brothers are concerned. They see Yosef, they think of Yosef in a sense as a kind of Esav figure. Not that they necessarily know about Esav's inner workings, but we know, we the reader know, and they suspect a similar thing will happen. Now that Yaakov's gone, Yosef will take revenge upon us, as they say. V'ashev yashiv lanu et kol hara'ah asher gamalnu oto. He will repay us for all the evil that we have done to him. He's going to pay us back. That's their concern. So they want to avoid that in some sense. What they think then, if we think about the Esav story, their concern is very simple. Our brother Joseph, who has actually sustained us for many years, that's when our father was alive. And now that father is gone, he plans to kill us. That's the concern, not to mistreat us. They think he plans to kill them, which is very striking. So to say they're deeply suspicious of Yosef would be the understatement of the century. He plans to kill us, as we'll see. Certainly that's what they're thinking. So therefore, they set a plan in motion to prevent Yosef from actually killing them. And the plan seems to have two parts. Beginning in the 16th pasuk, Vayetzavu el Yosef lemar. So they commanded somebody. they are giving instructions to some kind of a messenger, and they give commands to the messenger. The verb is vayitzavu, to command, and they deliver the following message to Yosef. Avicha tziva b'fnei moto lemar. Your father, it's Yaakov, not our father. Your father commanded, instructed before his death, just in the following way. Kol tomru li Yosef. Say this to Yosef. He commanded us to tell you. Ona sana pesha achecha v'chatatam ki ra'agim alucha. To please forgive the sin of your brothers, their sin. Two words, pesha and chet, both are used. Ra'ah. Please forgive the evil that they did to you. And now they're adding, presumably, that was the message from Father. V'yata, so now, sana pesha abdei Elohei avicha, forgive, please, the sin of the servants of your father's God. Vayef Yosef b'dabram elav. And when they said this to Joseph, Joseph cries. So let's just pick up the story at this point. First point we noted was that the same way Joseph has to beg the people of Pharaoh's court to be allowed to bury Yaakov, he doesn't speak to Paro directly. 3 times the word na appears in the beginning of the chapter. Not even to Paro, he's begging the servants of Paro. Here too, we have the word na appearing 3 times. So the brothers are begging Joseph to forgive them. They claim that Yaakov, prior to his death, had instructed Yosef to do so. Whether that's true or not, I'll get to in a minute. So we have here certainly a sense of very deep suspicion of Joseph. And we have, when the brothers say this to Yosef, Joseph cries. Just want to focus on this pasuk for a few moments. First question is obviously, did Yaakov actually say such a thing or not? We have no recording in the Chumash at all of Yaakov ever saying anything of the sort. And we do have speeches that Yaakov makes. Yaakov makes a bunch of speeches, but we don't have this particular speech that Yaakov made, namely to tell Yosef in my name to forgive you. So I think it's fair to say, I believe the simple shot is he never said it. And furthermore, why would he tell the brothers to tell Yosef? Why wouldn't he just say to Yosef directly, forgive the brothers for what they did to you? By the way, the very question presumes that Yaakov actually knows what the brothers did. Let's start with that. The Chumash is never explicit that the brothers ever told Yaakov what they did to Yosef. The Chumash is also certainly never explicit that Yosef told his father what they did, which is very striking. It would appear from the Torah that Yosef never says to his father. This is a guy, as a child, remember, when we first encountered Joseph back in chapter 37, he would bring Dibor Ra El Aviyam. This guy was busy bringing back evil report to his father about the brothers. Well, if you're into bringing back evil reports about your brothers to your father, what could be more evil? Like, hey, Dad, my brothers try to kill me and try to cover it up. And you're crying all these years, you can blame them. He never says that. We have no evidence whatsoever that he says that. So certainly Joseph, it's very striking that the talebearer Joseph says absolutely nothing. Nor do we have evidence that Yaakov knows. And we certainly have no evidence that Yaakov ever said anything of the sort. So let us assume, for all practical purposes, that he actually never said anything of the sort. But that doesn't mean he doesn't know. I think that
Sorry, one moment, Rabbi Silber, you got your sound cut out. Rabbi Silber, you accidentally unmuted and we didn't hear your half sentence. Can you speak up?
Yes, am I muted now?
Nope, now I can hear you. Sorry about that glitch.
I don't know what happened. I didn't do anything. All right, anyway, I'll repeat what I'm saying, what I said. I said, first of all, there is no evidence that Yaakov ever made this statement to his sons. Number two, there is no evidence that he was told either by his sons or more remarkably by Joseph himself about what actually happened. And in the case of Joseph not telling him anything, and we have no evidence that Joseph tells him anything, Joseph is a person that when you first meet him, the first thing you hear about Yosef in chapter 37 is that Vayaveh Yosef et dibatam ra'al avihem, that Joseph was a talebearer. He would report back to his brothers bad things either the brothers were saying or doing. And if you have a fellow who's a talebearer and wants to tell bad things about your brothers to your father, this will be a perfect opportunity. Nothing much worse than telling his father, they try to kill me, your favorite son, and cover it up. So there's no evidence that the brothers or Yosef told Yaakov anything. There's certainly no evidence Yaakov ever said this, but, and this is the big but, it doesn't mean Yaakov doesn't know or suspect. I think there is evidence in the Chumash that Yaakov does suspect. For example, when they come back from Egypt with money in their sacks, minus their brother Shimon, and Yaakov says, Yosef einenu v'Shimon einenu, Yosef is missing and Shimon is missing, now you would take this one? He certainly suggests, it's a suggestion, that he has some suspicions about Yosef being missing. But again, and then again, when he blessed all his sons in chapter 49, and the blessing of Joseph speaks about someone who was beset by enemies who try to harm him, and Joseph is able to stand firm and to withstand the threats of the enemies. And it's very not clear what enemies Yaakov is referring to, but it's certainly possible that Yaakov suspects, without saying anything, he suspects that there's something the brothers in some way or other are responsible for what happens to Yosef. The Chumash does not tell us one way or the other. It's actually very interesting. But I think there is certainly a sense that Yaakov may well know more than he lets on. But he certainly doesn't seem to say anything. So the brothers are, let's say, are making this up. I would also add something else about Yaakov, which I mentioned earlier, a couple of weeks ago. When Yaakov blesses Yosef and gives Yosef the extra portion, gives him the Bechorah because he has two sons, Menashe and Ephraim are considered to be Yaakov's own children. He makes the point that I give you an extra portion, Shem Achad Alachecha, more than your brothers. And what he seems to be saying is, Joseph, you have a blessing, a very special blessing, but it's in conjunction with your brothers. Remember that Yaakov's mission in this book is to build the family, is to include everybody, which he does when he blesses all of his sons. Some get better blessings, some get less good, but everybody is included. So the idea that Yaakov wants Yosef and the brothers to get along, to be part of one family, which was Yaakov's mission in life, that's obvious. So in other words, he may not have said these words, but in order for Yaakov's dream and mission to be fulfilled, he needs all the brothers to consider themselves part of one family. So obviously, he would be very much opposed to Yosef taking vengeance upon his brothers. So what the brothers are saying is certainly true in spirit. Whether Yaakov actually said this or not, that's another story. But the fact that the brothers feel that they have to resort to this, that's their concern is after Yaakov has died, their concern is Yosef will take vengeance, and they in order to forestall that, they bring Yaakov back into the picture. Our father Yaakov said to do X, and furthermore, they describe themselves as the sin of Pesha Avdei Elohei Avicha. We are the servants of the God of your father. So we have something in common. We all serve the same God. We're all the servants of and the God is the God of Yaakov. So on one hand, it speaks to the sense of concern the brothers have, what Yosef might do, the suspicion of Yosef. And they, on the other hand, and they want to find some way to forestall that. And the first way is to bring Yaakov back into the picture. And the next pasuk, actually, the second way, which is very striking, is in pasuk number 18, I'm sorry. says, Vayilchu gam echav, vayiplu lefanav, vayomru, hinenu l'cha la'avodim. So the next verse, the brothers go to Yosef, bow down before him, and say, we are prepared to be your slaves. Remember back to the story of Binyamin, that the issue over there was, what would the punishment for Binyamin be and the brothers? The brothers had said, whoever stole the goblet should die and will be slaves. And Joseph's envoy says, no, nobody's going to die. I don't want anybody to die. He'll be a slave and you go free. So here the brothers, when they go before Joseph and say, take us as slaves, what they're trying to do is to preempt what they think he plans to do, which is to kill them. Just to reflect on this for a moment, this is somebody who's been helping them for all of these years, gives them a special place, feeds them, takes care of them, and they still suspect that after Yaakov dies, he plans to kill them. I want to make one more point about this, and that is that what they're thinking probably is the following, that when Yosef revealed his identity to his brothers back in chapter 45, Ani Yosef, and he said, go tell my father that Joseph is alive, tell him to come down to Mitzrayim with everything he has, don't leave anything behind. I will feed him and his children and his whole household. Joseph put it in terms of tell father Jacob, tell my father, our father, that I'll feed him and his children. But his children are Joseph's brothers. When Joseph says, I will take care of you, he doesn't say, I'll take care of you. He says, I'll take care of father and father's children, which certainly lends itself to the thought that once our father is gone, he has no direct commitment to us. The commitment was to Yaakov and his children. But he never said, I'm committed to you. He will say it now, but he never said it before. Make one last point, and I'll stop and take comments and questions. And that when the brothers say this to Joseph, Vayef Yosef b'dabra me'elav, and Joseph cries. And that's actually very striking, because Joseph has cried many times in the Joseph narrative. But specifically, when it comes to the brothers, he cries on 4 occasions. Just to refresh our memory, he cries when he hears the brothers saying, after Joseph has threatened them, he hears the brothers saying, we are, this is terrible things are happening to us. We are responsible for our brother. We heard his cries and we didn't respond properly. And Joseph hears this and he cries. And he hears Reuven say, I told you not to do it. So he takes Shimon as a hostage. That's the first time he cries. And then he cries again when he meets Binyamin. When they bring Binyamin down to Mitzrayim, Joseph sees Binyamin is overtaken. He goes to a different room and he cries privately there. First time he turned aside and cried. Second time he goes to a different room and cries. So the second time he cries. And the third time he cries is when Yehuda says to Yosef, I made a promise to my father. I don't want to see him suffer because this is his child, the only one left to the woman he loved, to Rachel. So take me instead. Let me stay I'll be your slave, and let this kid go back to his father. And Yosef can't restrain himself. He can't restrain himself. And now the fourth time he cries, when they all say to him, forgive us, we'll be your slaves. Our father wants you to forgive us, etc., because we did evil. They are repenting of the evil. And once again, he cries. So you could track this, and basically, Joseph's crying. Each time he cries, it suggests that Joseph feels more and more connected to his brothers. And over here, you have explicit statement that they're making to Yosef. We recognize that we have actually sinned, pesha and chait, and therefore we probably deserve to be killed or whatever. But same way you were sold as a slave, we'll become your slaves as well. So it does speak to something in the Yosef story that's very central to it, which is that the Chumash has presented Yosef. It's very unusual that it gives us a kind of psychological insight into Joseph. That on one hand, Joseph is the viceroy of Egypt. He dresses like the Egyptian. He works for Pharaoh. He's married to the daughter of the priest of Egypt, has an Egyptian name and all that. On the other hand, So internally, actually, something happening within Joseph, and his connection to his brothers becomes more and more powerful. And the Chumash presents it that way. It's very unusual that you have this kind of, I would say, for the Bible, a rather extensive profiling of this character. So I have more to say about this. Let me stop at this point and take any comments or questions.
Silber,
Yep.
it seems that the brothers are so out of tune, or they are so afraid with Joseph that they don't notice his crying and no reaction to it. They continue in the same vein. Now we'll be slaves to you.
That's true. That is very striking. Actually, here he doesn't hide it. In the first two cases, he actually, in the first and second time that he cries, he turns aside, he goes to a different room. Here he is crying even as they speak to him, but maybe they wonder why he's crying. Is he crying because he remembers the terrible things that happened? Is he crying because he realizes they don't actually trust him? The Chumash doesn't really tell us. It's very, as typically, it's very terse. So, but your point is a very good point, that actually, even though he's crying, the very next verses take us as your slaves, which is, I think, an interesting response. That's a very interesting observation. Is there anybody else?
Yeah,
Yes.
could I ask, who do you think is present in verse 17 when Yosef cries? The problem is that in verse 18, it says, Vayelchu gam echav, implying that they weren't there. And in the previous verse, it's v'yitzavu. So the brothers commanded someone to go to Yosef, but it doesn't suggest that maybe one of the brothers, it doesn't
It's a very good point. Yeah, it's unclear, actually, whether, in other words, in verse 17, they're sending a message in verse 16 through somebody else, that's for sure. And the message is detailed in verse number 17. The question is what the last half of verse 17 means. It could be that the brothers aren't there. You're saying that's certainly a possible reading. When he hears this message, he cries.
Right. He gets the message from the brothers, and he cries.
Right.
And then the brothers come themselves after the messenger.
Right. And I understand what you're saying. Right. That's certainly a good possibility. That's very possible. I liked it even better than what I said. I think that it's interesting, by the way, that the message is sent by more than one person. It says Vayitzavu. It's not clear. El Yosef. They're commanding, the brothers command someone to bring the message. It's not clear whether it's one person or a bunch of people. But that is plural when they spoke. So that sounds like maybe there's more than one. It's very unclear.
More than one messenger. More than one messenger.
Why you need more than one messenger? I don't know. Maybe out of etiquette, just to go to I don't know. But in any event, your point is well taken. I don't know. But in any event, he's certainly crying one way or the other about what he hears. And maybe he cries because he realizes they actually suspect him. Right. And then the follow-up, as you say, then they go personally, take us as your avodim.
Isn't it kind of Isn't it an interesting contrast that the brothers are united this time? Because in the past, when they've come up with things to do with him, there was always somebody that disagreed, but now they're like a united front, right?
Right. I wouldn't say they were always that way. In the latter stories, Judah speaks up, but it's not clear that anybody disagrees with Judah when he says, "Take me." But Yehuda speaks up. I think in the course of the Yosef story, I think there is a sense where the brothers, yes, Ruvain talks up one time, "I told you not to do it." That's Ruvain. That's typically, and on the sale of Joseph, there's a disagreement, Ruvain and Yehuda, etc. That's Ruvain more that "I told you so." But I think after that, I would say that there is a sense in the story that the brothers take responsibility. For example, remember when they first go back to Egypt and Joseph has put the money back in their sacks. And before they get home, it says that one of the people, Echad, opened up his sack and he sees the money. And he sees the money's back. The other brothers don't check for whatever reason. And it says, Vayomru, Ma'asa Elohim Lanu. What has God done to us? And one of the points I made at the time was, you don't say, what has God done to you? Even though only one person has the money in his sack, but they see that as a kind of collective response, right? And when they talk to each other, this is happening to us because of what we did to we didn't respond to our brother. So there's a sense, and when they find them, the goblet in Binyamin's sack, they say, and we shall be slaves. They don't say yet just he should suffer. They take a kind of collective responsibility. I think that's an important point. So that is happening. But the question is, where's Joseph in all this? Is Joseph part of it or not part of it? And this,
but they're taking a collective statement without the fear of God. He reminds them, we're tachat Elohim.
No, I don't think that's what he's saying. I'll get to that. That's the next part. So I will get to that verse very soon. I would say something else over here though, which is very striking. That on one hand they talk about forgive the sin of the servants of your father's God. Pesha avdei Elohei avicha. And the next pasuk says they fall down and they say to Joseph, "Will be your slaves." It strikes me as very interesting that they self-describe themselves as the avadim of the God of Jacob. But the very next verse, they say, "Take us as your avadim."
Right.
I wonder what. Yes.
No, that's what I meant. That was
right. So I think it's very striking. Now, the truth of the matter is, this leads into the next pasuk. We have to remember something about Joseph, which he's going to say next as well. That with Yosef, till this point, when Joseph speaks about God, for example, both when he interprets the dreams, and he's in jail with the baker and the butler, and Joseph sees them, they're very upset. Says, "What is wrong? We had a dream." We had dreams, and there's nobody to interpret the dreams. And Joseph's response is, "Halo Elohim pitronim sapru nali." Those interpretations aren't interpretations in the realm of God. Tell me your dream. What does that mean? Same thing with Pharaoh, right? Pharaoh, I heard you're a very good interpreter of dreams. I'm not going to interpret your dreams. Elohim yaneh shalom paro. God will interpret your dreams. And after Joseph interprets the dreams, it says to Pharaoh, get someone very wise to manage your affairs. And Pharaoh says, after God has told you the interpretation, who's wiser than you? So I think in the Joseph story, I think it's an important point, actually, that Joseph somehow sees himself. Yes, God may interpret dreams, but God works through Joseph. If God's going to interpret your dreams, tell me your dream. So the way Joseph sees himself as, he is the conduit through which God speaks. That's how Joseph has seen himself till now. When you see yourself always as God works through me, it certainly lends itself to the possibility that somehow we can blur the difference between the God who interprets, who understands, and the actual interpreter. Right? So Joseph sees himself as, he always talks about God. I'm not going to take you all your Elohim ani yoreh. He always talks about himself vis-a-vis God. But the question is, what exactly is the relationship? And that leads us to the next. In other words, here they say we are the servants of God, of your father. Now we want to be your servants, avodim. And Joseph's response in the next verse is very striking. Vayomer alehem Yosef, this is in verse number 19, al tiro, don't be afraid. Ki atachat Elohim ani. Am I instead of God? Am I in place of God? Now that expression, am I in place of God? First of all, it's not the first time we encountered that in this book. There's one other place in the book where we have that virtually identical expression. And that's back in chapter 30. Back in chapter 30, that's when Rachel has no children, and her sister, Leah, now has 4 children. And Leah feels very much Jacob's wife. She was in the word, she was hated, she was not loved or whatever. And then she has 4 children. God intervenes on her behalf. And after Judah is born, now I will thank God. Now I will praise God or thank God. Next verse of chapter 30, verse 1, is Rachel saw she had no children. She was jealous of her sister. And she says to Jacob, give me children or else I will die. Hoveli banim. B'yemayin meito anochi. That's the response. That's what Rachel says. Sister has 4 children, she has none. And Yaakov responds in verse number 2. Yaakov says to his Vayicharaf Yaakov Rachel. Yaakov was angry at Rachel, got very angry. Vayomer Hatachat Elohim Anochi Asher Monami Mech Pribaten. Says Jacob to Rachel, what am I, in place of God? Do I have the ability to do this? God has prevented you from having children. That's what God has done. I have no power to overturn that. Who do you think I am? Do you think you think I'm God? From the way he states it, by the way, you see what she does think. She believes that if you really wanted to, you could somehow enable me to have children. You could maybe manipulate God. But that's what she thinks. And Yaakov gets very angry. Yaakov says, that's not in I don't have the ability to do that. Now, whether he should got angry at his beloved Rachel, or he could have tried to console her, that's another story. Some of the Mefarshim, including Rashi, take him to task. You don't talk that way to this woman, but that's another story. But Atachat Elohim Anochi, this is the other place where you have the statement, where someone thinks, Rachel believes that he can somehow manipulate God. And by the way, we just read recently the Parshat Hashavua, Parshat Toldot. I would frame it this way: I hear you're very good at stealing blessings, my beloved Jacob. Maybe you'll steal one for me. And the end of the parsha, this week's parsha, he manipulates all the animals. Right? He's very good at manipulating the animals so that they will give birth to the better flock. He's very good to manipulating the sheep, right? The speckled and the spotted. He's very good at stealing blessings. So she says to him, and she is Lavan's daughter, she says to him, how about stealing one for me? And she threatens him, otherwise I will die. And his response is, listen, I'm not God. I can't really do anything. I can't help you. That's the response. She thinks he can. He says, I can't. I mention that just because now we come to that expression in a different context over here. And the point is, take it or leave it, but my point is that the brothers see Joseph as somebody who sees himself who basically plays God. And when you think about the Joseph story and the brothers, nobody is more manipulative than Joseph, maybe for good ends. He puts money in the sacks, he puts goblets in the sacks, he does all kinds of stuff to try to manipulate everything. He's going to work it all out at the end. Maybe he's testing them, whatever interpretation you want to give to it. But that's how they see him. They see Joseph as somebody who sees himself as somehow fully in league with God. The person who said, interpretation of dreams, only God can interpret dreams. Tell me your dream. And now we have Joseph's response. If you read it this way, Hatachet Elohim Ani becomes a very powerful confession on Joseph's part. Joseph is saying, you know something? You may see me as one who through whom God will work, and is God's full partner. And it is true that God works through me, but I'm certainly not God's partner. I'm God's servant too. I'm a God-fearing person too. So I'm not going to do anything which contravenes what God wants. Now, he had said this earlier, but he emphasized it over here, and he adds a very important point in these psukim, which is a very powerful point. It says, "Vatem chashavtem olai ra'ah." It says, you thought to do me evil. Elohim chashava l'tova, but God had a different plan. God worked this all out for good. Luban aso kayom hazeh lachayot amrav. God's plan was for good. So therefore, he says, and this he said even earlier, this is nothing so novel. God's plan was for good, and I have to accede to what God wanted. It's true that you did have bad intentions. That doesn't actually matter because this is part of God's plan. And Joseph sees the world differently from other people. He does see the world totally in terms of God's plan, and God was using me and using you to carry out God's plan, which and he said this earlier, was to feed a great nation. I'm here in Mitzrayim to feed the world, to feed you, to take care of you, and frankly, to save Mitzrayim, because that's what he does. It's not just about the brothers. He does seem to give them preferential treatment, but Joseph sees himself as one who sustains the world. But that's the first thing. That he more or less said earlier. But now he's going to say two other very important things. And the first one is the next pasuk. Afterwards, I'll stop for a moment. V'atol tiro. So now he says, don't be afraid. Anochi achalkel etchem v'yatabchem. I will take care, feed you, care for you and your children. Vayinachem otam, vayidaber alibam. So the verse has two parts to it, which are very striking. Number one, in terms of what I had said earlier, the initial commitment to the brothers to take care of them was, I will take care of my father Jacob and his children. He never made a direct commitment to them. And here it's a direct commitment to them. I will take care of you and your children. It's not through Yaakov, not through the father. I'm going to take care of you. That's number one. And number two, what is very striking, here they say reassured. But reassured is not really a translation of Vayinachem otam. Vayinachem otam, he actually comforted them. Vayidaber alibam, he speaks kindly to them. You have that expression with Dinah and Shem, actually. Vayidaber alevhan, afterwards, he speaks tenderly to her. So over here, you have Joseph comforting them, which is very striking, actually. Because they're the ones who try to kill him, basically, to harm him. But he sees his role now as somehow comforting them, which is very powerful. I just want to, before I stop and take some comments and questions, I also want to make one point that has been, I think, the most important point of all in terms of this whole cycle. Yaakov has a mission in life. His mission in life, and we read it this past Shabbat, is to somehow build the bayit. That's his mission. His father couldn't do it. His grandfather couldn't do it. They only could choose one child to continue the covenantal blessing. And Yaakov takes a vow, if you give me the opportunity, I will build Beit Elohim, the house. He calls his family the house. In order for that to work, because the house is filled with all kinds of tensions. There's the relationship of Yaakov to his sons. There's the relationship of the sons to Yaakov. Problems on both sides. The story of Dinah bears that out, and other stories as well, when the brothers come back. Then there's Yaakov and Yosef. Yaakov caused to sail. And there's Joseph towards his father. Joseph has said, I want to forget my father's house. And then you have Joseph and the brothers. That is, the brothers towards Joseph, but Joseph towards the brothers. And on top of all that, you have the place of Rachel, the Truffim stealer, the Avodah Zarah stealer. What's her place? In order for the bayit to work, every piece of this has to be worked out. The main person who works it out is actually Yaakov. Yaakov brings the whole family together when he goes down to Mitzrayim. And that actually is his mission. But it has to work in both directions. So the brothers feel very guilty, and the brothers, take responsibility to some extent, even though they make up the story. But they do say, we sinned, They do it through a third party. But the fact of the matter is, so they're trying to reconcile with Joseph. But the point of the Chumash is, for this to actually work, it's got to work in both directions. And Joseph has to also really forgive them. They have to say we're guilty, and he has to forgive them. And here you have in this verse, very striking, he actually consoles them. He speaks tenderly to them. Vayinachem otam, vayidaber alibam. Of course, the Chumash typically does not ever suggest necessarily that there's a full and complete sense of the two coming fully together. At the end of the day, first of all, Joseph sees the world differently from all of us, because we would all say, okay, God had a plan. That doesn't let you off the hook. God has many plans, but your intention was bad. You wanted to kill me. But Joseph doesn't see it that way. He sees the world fully in terms of God's plan. And secondly, the brothers don't really trust him. They do think he plans to kill them after their father has died. So one could argue that even after all is said and done, there remains always certain tensions which play out later in terms of the Tanakh. The fact of the matter is the country becomes divided. Yehuda on one hand and Ephraim on the other, which is Joseph, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom. The tensions are always there. The question is there a way to overcome the tensions and to work out have a plan which people can in fact live together, even though there's some discomfort with each other. But over here, it's very striking that Vayinachem otam, vayidaber alibam. I would add one last point before I stop and take comments, questions, or whatever, and that is that the verb lenachem, it appears with Yitzchak, by Nachem Yitzchak Acharei Mo, and I think that, but it also appears in the Chumash and the Bible in some very significant places. But the first place it appears, Vayinachem Hashem ki asa ta'adam ba'aretz vayitzatzev el libo, that God regretted that God had created a human, and that is the introduction to the story of the Mabul, where God destroys the world and builds a new world. And Vayinachem appears later in Sefer Shemot, next book that will start hopefully next week. There too, at the story of the golden calf, God threatens to destroy Israel, and Moshe intercedes on our behalf. Vayinachem Hashem achara asher diber la'asot li'amo, and somehow Moshe is able through his prayers to overcome that, and Israel continues to be God's people. Then you have in the story of Shmuel, God appoints Saul as the first king of Israel, but God regrets this. Nichamti ki imlachti et Shaul. So in all of these cases, there's some cataclysmic event where God either decides to start everything all over again, such as in the case of the world. In the case of Shaul, kingship of Saul is finished, a new kind of kingship, the autonomous king. Case of the ego, God had decided to destroy Israel and to create a new path to fulfill the covenant. And Moshe rejects God's offer and is able to turn it around. So over here, in that spirit, I would say that what Joseph is basically saying is, what the brothers are saying is we can't be a bayit. In which case, Yaakov's vision will not be fulfilled, and Joseph is able to overcome, to forgive them, as it were. Vayinachem otam vayidaber libam is a way of saying, as this book ends, that yes, the brothers will be able to function as one family. That's the significance over here. In which case, Yaakov's very vision, which was so difficult to make happen, because Yaakov is his own worst enemy. Yaakov favors Yosef, etc., etc. And this verse suggests that maybe it actually can happen. We can be one family. Now, there's another piece to this, which I'll get to in one moment. But before that, let me just stop for a moment. If anybody has any comments, questions, or whatever, speak up.
Rabbi?
Yep.
Question. I think you said a while ago that whether Yaakov knew about what happened. In the Brahman, when it says "Uvirt sonam ikru shor," isn't that a hint? You may have known that.
Yes, I mentioned that earlier without citing the specific verse, especially given the fact that the shor is identified with Joseph later in the Chumash. And not only that, even in the bracha for Yosef himself, "Banot sa'ada alei shur," which is Shin Vav Reish, is probably another literary effect to recall that Joseph is the shor. I that's what I said earlier. I agree. Thank you for pointing out the particular verse, Shimon and Levi. But the fact is, Vayistamu v'robu, Vayistom, they hated him. They tried to harm him, right? The balei chitzim, etc. And he was able to withstand it. Now he doesn't say it's the brothers, but certainly there's a sense who are these enemies that Joseph withstood. It could be Mitzrayim, could be his own brothers. So I do think there's strong reason to see, and I mentioned other things as well. There's strong reason to believe that Yaakov knows a lot more than he lets on, but he never actually directly says anything. He says other things. He says, "Yosef, your blessing is with the brothers," etc., and all that. But again, the Chumash doesn't make explicit that certainly these words were never explicitly stated by Yaakov. But I agree with you that the certainly is evidence that Yaakov knows very well, and he tries to work it a different way. And he seems to have faith in his children; they'll be able to work it out. Yeah. Anybody else for a comment or question?
Yes. Question. That it says in verse 20, "Atem chashavtem alai ra'a," you thought bad things. It doesn't say "Atem asitem li ra'a."
Right. So the point is that his point, though, is that after all is said and done, here I am, the viceroy of Egypt, very successful. It all worked out at the end for good. Right. You raise a very interesting question, and I would say the following: the brothers. Why is it that after Yaakov dies, the brothers think that Joseph will now take his revenge? So I spoke about that. My main point was that they saw their relationship to their brother through the father. There is another point over here which I wanted to suggest in the spirit of what your question is, which is what I wonder about is whether, remember that this chapter begins with Joseph having to beg the servants of Paro to be allowed to bury his father and he has to promise to come back. And the point that I made last week is that at this point in the story, he can't even speak to Paro directly. And the suggestion was because the truth of the matter is that Paro doesn't really need him that much anymore. Because what Joseph is put in office to do is to give Paro all the money and all the cattle and all the land of the Egyptians. Well, he has all that. So therefore, he's not really that needed. And the moment Paro doesn't need you, you suddenly discover that you can't, he's always busy, can't take your call. So at this point, perhaps the Chumash is suggesting that the brothers don't see things that, it's one thing when Joseph's doing so well, but now when they see the way it's moving, and now maybe Joseph will see it not in terms of look how successful I am, but rather what a mess I'm in. And then it would take vengeance on us for having caused him to be in this bad situation. That's also a possibility. In any event, but Joseph, as I said, Joseph sees the world differently. He says, listen, it turned out for the best because I was able to feed everybody. That's the first thing he says. And therefore, I don't hold it against you. We would not necessarily have that point of view because they did try to kill him, etc. And they did cause him to be a slave and all that. And he did take vengeance on them in a sense earlier. I mean, they put them through all these, he does, manipulate things in such a way, puts them in jail, he sends them back. There's a lot of fear, etc. Maybe it's a test, maybe not. We talked about that. But in the event, at this point, what he says is, this was God's plan, and it was all for the good. That's what he says. That's the first point he makes. But then we have the end of the book. And the end of the book, I think, is very, very, endings are always very significant. And here we have something very striking in these last few verses of Sefer Bereshit. It says, Vayeshev Yosef b'Mitzrayim hu beit Aviv, Vayichi Yosef me'avi eser shanim. So Joseph lived in Egypt with his father's house. I presume that means his brothers and their families. And Joseph lived for 110 years. Now I'll get back to the 110 years in a couple of minutes. He lives for 110 years. Now the Chumash says, Vayar Yosef li Ephraim b'nei Shileshim, that Joseph lived to see children of the third generation of Ephraim. Gab b'nei Machir ben Menashe yuldu al birkei Yosef. And even the children of Machir ben Menashe were born on Joseph's knees. That's a very striking verse, actually. Remember when Yaakov comes down and meets Joseph, and he says, Joseph, I want to bless your two sons. They'll be my sons. And the Chumash said, if you remember back in chapter 48, Joseph took them off his knees. And the point that we made at that time was that the knee, the raise on someone's knee, what Joseph is in a sense giving up the parent to it and handing it over to Jacob, who's going to bless them as his children, as Jacob said, these are my sons. So here it says that they're born on Joseph's knees in the sense that after all is said and done, Joseph reclaims these children. Ephraim and Menashe and their descendants are born on Joseph's knees. And what Yaakov did was temporarily, by necessity, saying, these are my children. This is the way it's got to be. Ephraim is primary, Menashe is secondary, etc., etc. But now Joseph has understood the father's message, and now he can truly be called the father of Menashe and Ephraim, and the ancestry and the descendants as well. So that's a very important point. Now we continue with this. Yosef Elechav Anochi Meit. So Joseph said to his brothers, behold, I die. Ve'Elohim pokod yifkod etchem, ve'elo etchem min haaretz hazot, el haaretz Hashem nishba Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. This is a verse of enormous significance. It's really mind-boggling verse. Says Joseph, I'm going to die. God will pakod yivkod etchem. With code, here the translator says take notice. I don't know why he says take notice, but with code has many meanings. One is to actually redeem. I'll get back to the word with code, which is very important here, obviously. Hashem pakadet sarah means more than taking notice. God redeems. God blesses Sarah. God will certainly redeem you and bring you up out of this land, Zot, to the land that God has sworn to give to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. This is a verse of enormous significance. And it's rather remarkable verse, because we remember in the previous verse it talks about Menashe and Ephraim. We all remember that when Joseph has his first child in Egypt, born to the daughter of the high priest of Egypt, or one of the high priests, Cohen On, he named his son Menashe, for he had said, Nashani Ohim et Amolivi et Korbeit Avi. I'm able to forget my suffering and my father's house. His son is named Forgetfulness. And the same person who named his son Forgetfulness, whose name is recorded in the previous verse, talks about leaving this land, not even Mitzrayim, this place, to bring you up to the land that God has sworn to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's a remarkable verse. I mean, here he talks about not just the land of Canaan, not just, our ancestral home, but the place that God has sworn, Nishma, to give to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, to the Avot. We remember that when Yaakov tells Joseph, get me out of Mitzrayim and bury me in my ancestral family grave, Joseph says, I'll do it. And Yaakov says to Joseph, swear to me you'll do it. Ishavali, and he swears. And the swearing, we discussed at the time why he makes him swear. But one possibility is he's going to do it. I want you to understand something about going up to the land. It's God's land. A shavua is something the imposition of God's name. And here we have Joseph talking about this land, the same guy who said Menashe. He's talking about the land that God gave to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And not only that, the idea of the shvua comes up in the very next verse. Vayashba Yosef et bnei Yisrael lemar, pakod yifkod Elohim etchem. Joseph imposes an oath upon his brothers, the same way Yaakov imposed an oath upon Joseph. Joseph now imposes an oath upon the brothers. When God redeems you, bring my bones up out of here. What Joseph is saying is, I also don't want to be buried in Mitzrayim. I'm not going to be buried with Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. They're different. They're the Avot. I'm not one of the Avot. But I want to be buried in that place. He doesn't say specifically where in the land, but I impose upon you. He imposes upon them the obligation to take me with you. When you leave here someday, take me with you. Now, I wanted to say a couple of more things about this verse and its great significance over here. Of course, we remember in the Chumash, when we do leave Mitzrayim, they do take Joseph's bones, right? Atzmot Yosef, they take Joseph's bones, and the one who takes Joseph's bones is Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe takes the bones of Yosef because Joseph had forsworn Israel to do exactly that. It's Moshe who takes the bones of Yosef. When we get to Sefer Shemot, start next week, we'll talk about Yosef and Moshe. I'll maybe even mention something in a few minutes about this. So that is, he's saying something else. Pakod yifkod Elohim etchem, v'alitem et atzmotai mizer. I have a couple of points I want to make about Pakod yifkod Elohim etchem. First of all, Pakod yifkod, the word pakad can mean to deliver, to redeem, to remember. It has another meaning as well that I'll come to in a minute. But the point is, what Joseph seems to be saying is, listen, someday God will get us out of here. Someday God will redeem us. And when God redeems Israel and takes us out of this place to the land of Canaan, the land of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the covenantal land, I want to be part of that. And here we come to another point about Yosef, which is up to this point, when Joseph speaks about his role, God has chosen him for a certain path, a certain role. And Joseph says, and yes, you may have thought evil, but God had a plan. And the plan was, he said this twice now, at least twice, L'achayot amrav, to bring life and sustenance to a great nation, to you, to the world, to Mitzrayim. But over here, he says something different, I believe, additional. He says, my mission in life was not just to feed the nation, but rather, the truth of the matter is that what Joseph's mission is, and the great significance of the story of Joseph is, it's through Joseph that the brothers find themselves in the land of Egypt. Because remember that Joseph is the one who says to the brothers, everybody should come down here. Tell my father to come down. I'm going to feed him. He'll see me. I'll take care of him. He gives them land. And they become attached to Mitzrayim. They become really attached to Mitzrayim. But going down to Egypt is actually part of the covenantal process. Because in this book, the covenantal obligation is Gerut, Avdut, and Inui, to be a stranger, to be oppressed, and to be a slave. And the enslavement of the Jewish people would not be possible if not for Joseph. So therefore, Joseph is part of God's plan. But he's part of God's plan not just in terms of feeding his brothers. That's a temporary. But he's part of God's plan in terms of enslaving the people as a precursor to the covenantal blessing. And in point of fact, you already see in this chapter 50 that Israel is not getting out of Mitzrayim. First of all, Joseph has to swear he's going to come back. And we have the shvur in the beginning of chapter 50. And then we were told, almost parenthetically, that when the brothers went up with Joseph to bury their father, as we saw last week, Rak Tapam, right? Mikdam, Behemtam, Azbu B'Eretz Goshen. They leave behind the children, they leave behind the cattle. In other words, you can go and bury your father. Why even mention that? Because the point is, they have to come back. They can't leave. And the army that Pharaoh sends, is it to protect Joseph or is it to make sure he does return? In other words, they're already enslaved. In the sense, what's a slave? You can't leave. You're stuck there. And it seems that Joseph may have a recognition of this when he talks about God redeeming. If this be true, and it's at the very end, and almost the last verses of the story of Yosef, where he comes to a very profound understanding that we are in fact slaves. And what makes this, I think, remarkable is that he's lecturing them about the land of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. I mean, it's unbelievable. He's the one who tells them that we are actually slaves and that God will someday redeem us. And when this happens, we will be reunited. In other words, part of the way it works, I think, what he's saying is something, what he or the Chumash is saying is, it could be that in our lifetimes, there's a lot of animosity. We have histories with each other. But someday, we in fact will be reunited. After my death, maybe after your death as well, maybe your descendants will bring us. But in the future, the groundwork has been laid for Joseph and the brothers optimally to be one family. That's what Joseph is saying. And you have the responsibility to bring my bones back with you. I impose upon you the oath. We had this earlier in the book, the imposition of the oath. Abraham imposed the oath on his servant. Jacob imposes the oath on Joseph. Joseph imposes the oath on the brothers. And what he's really saying is, as a conclusion to the book, which is, we are in exile, but you are obligated to someday to leave this place, go to the land of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and obligated to take me with you. And then we truly will be reunited, but only after my death. Now, I have a couple more things I want to say here, but let me stop at this point and take comments or questions.
And if you can't, if you're an attendee, I'm happy to unmute you.
Rabbi, do you think the connection between Moshe and Yosef is that Moshe is a descendant of Shevet Levi, and Levi was the one who was spearheading to kill Yosef?
I don't know if that's the connection. That the Moshe being a Levi is very important, as we'll see. I'll tell you what I think. I'll respond to you in a couple of minutes when we just finish up this morning. I have something to say about that. And this will be a theme of Moshe and Yosef and the connection between them. But that's something we'll deal more in depth when we get to Sefer Shemot. Maybe not immediately, but in Sefer Shemot, Yosef and Moshe are kind of continuum, as we'll see. They're deeply connected to each other. I'll say a few words at the end this morning. So I'll get to that point about Yosef, the relation of Yosef and Moshe. I'll deal with that. Is there anybody else who wants to comment or question?
This may be a minor point, but it seems like the order should be reversed earlier, that he spoke to their heart and they Vaynochem. Shouldn't Vaynochem come after he spoke to their heart?
I don't know, actually. I have to think about that. Question is, when he's speaking to the heart, I see this all part of one thing. He talks to them gently. He tries to. You have it with Dinah. He loved Dinah, and he by daber aliba. I mean, he had raped this woman basically, and oppressed her, and then he actually falls in love with her. So he's trying, in a sense, to console her, to say, it's going to be okay, and all this. The Chumash does present him as, it's very striking actually, as he actually falls in love with her. He actually seems to care about it. By Yahav, he loves her actually. And by daber alev hanaras, to console her, because she's been through a terrible ordeal inflicted upon her by him. But so by daber alev and by Yenachim are somehow connected to each other. I'm not sure about the order. That's to what extent we can. I have nothing to say about the order, but I think the two things go together. That's my point. I don't know. Let me just conclude here with yes.
I seem to recall that another point on Pakod Yivkod is that doesn't Moses use that expression as a code expression to identify himself to the elders of Egypt when he arrives?
Yes, he does. That is true. Let me deal with Pakod Yivkod. First of all, what Jerome says is very true, and the Mefarshim point this out. When Moshe goes back to Egypt, he's concerned that people won't actually believe him. So he talks about Pakod Yivkod. He uses the language of Pakod Yivkod, which some of the Mefarshim see as a kind of code. Because who are you? But they remember, according to the Medrash anyway, the language of Joseph. So the biblical author remembers it, right? The Chumash remembers it, but the point is that so Rashi noted that Pakod Yivkod, when Moshe goes to Mitzrayim, he actually uses the language of Pakod Yivkod. I did want to mention something else, which a friend of mine said to me many years ago, and I fully agree with it. And I want to mention something about Pakod Yivkod. So the word Pakod is a word that has many meanings in the Bible, many meanings. To redeem, to count. Right? Chomish HaPekudim, the book of Numbers, to take account, right? Lifkod is to count. Lifkod is to remember. Lifkod is to redeem. And Lifkod has another meaning as well. Lifkod can mean to hold someone accountable, which is related to another word in the Chumash, Hafkedo Halviyim. The Leviyim are counted separately. Why they counted separately? So they counted twice in the Chumash, in the book of Numbers. They're two numberings. The second time they don't have land. So the second count is for those who possess land. But the first time it's mentioned in the beginning of the book of Bamidbar, I've spoken about this many times, it doesn't say anything about land. It makes a different point by implication, which is they counted differently because they have a different relationship. They were not involved in the sin of the golden calf. And therefore, because they weren't involved in the sin of the golden calf, not just not involved, they had the civil war, and they killed their fellow Jews. So the Leviyim actually are separated from the others. It's kind of exile. But it's a funny kind of exile, because it's an exile where you're closer to God. They dwell right around the Mishkan in the book of Bamidbar, and the other tribes dwell further away in groups of 3, 4 groups of 3. In other words, they have a different tafkid. You count them differently because they have a different pekudah, different tafkid. They work in the Mishkan. So the word lifkod has multiple meanings. In fact, to hold someone accountable, to be accountable, to count, and to remember. In English, you have exactly the same thing, right? Because to hold accountable is one thing. To count someone, and then to remember, to recount, right? To recount means to remember. So in English, you have exactly the combination of those 3 meanings: to remember, to hold accountable, and to count. And the point is, Pokod Yifkod, that expression, it does appear in the beginning of Sefer Shemot when Moshe goes to Mitzrayim, as Jerome and Rashi before him noted, but it appears in another place in the book of Shemot. And that is that in the story of the golden calf, when Moshe intervenes on behalf of the people, and God says to Moshe, the end of chapter 32, go back to the people and lead them, Uviyom Pokdi, Ufokadati Alehem Chatatam. On the day of my remembering, the day of judgment, I will hold them accountable. And the next verse is Vayigof Hashem Ta'am, and God caused the plague to fall upon the people because they had made the golden calf which Aaron had made. Poked Avon Avot Al Banim, to visit the sins of the father upon the children. Poked Avon Avot. We have that in the Torah, right? We have it in the Torah. So we have it more than once in the Torah. I think the 10 Commandments is there as well, right? Golden calf is the 13 attributes. Poked Avon Avot Al Banim. And here, my friend many years ago suggested, and I fully agree, that when Joseph says to the brothers, Pokod Yifkod Elohim Etchem, that actually what it means is someday God will redeem you. And when God redeems you, God will in fact then take you out. Make sure you bring me with you. But actually, perhaps there's another additional significance over here. Because what Joseph has said all along, the brothers say, listen, we know we tried to kill you, we know we mistreated you, we know you sent him to exile, the whole life you were in Mitzrayim, and now things are looking so good. Take us, this was God's plan, says Joseph. This was God's plan. So I'm not God. It's all up to God. But the next to last verse is, Pokod Yifkod Elohim Etchem. What Joseph is saying is something else. God will redeem you, yes. But God will also hold you accountable. In other words, the story of the suffering in Mitzrayim and all that it entails in Egypt and beyond, says Joseph, Pokod Yifkod Elohim Etchem. God will hold you accountable for what you've done. I'm not holding you accountable because I'm in God's hand. We're all in God's hands. But someday when God will redeem you, but at the same time, Pokod Yifkod Elohim Etchem. It's interesting, by the way, just to one or two final thoughts here. It's interesting that on Rosh Hashanah, in the davening of Rosh Hashanah, so we have 3 parts to the davening: Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofrot. So the middle section is called Zichronot, remembrances. And the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah talks about, it's a set of psukim. You read psukim on Rosh Hashanah. So what verses are appropriate? There's a whole discussion at the end of Rosh Hashanah. The Gemara comments, Pikedono tarehem kidzichronot. If you read a verse from the Bible that has the word pakad instead of zachar, then if it fits all the other criteria, that's fine. But it's interesting, in our Rosh Hashanah service, in Zichronot, the word pakad does not appear in the psukim. There are 10 verses, but the word zachar appears in all the verses, and not the word pakad. Because the word pakad has that double meaning of holding accountable. In fact, if you're thinking about the book of Numbers, the book of Pikudim, book of Bamidbar, after the story of the spies, the Meraglim, God says to Moshe, those spies that traveled for those 40 days, right? I'm going to pay you back according to the ones who were numbered. called pekudechem. In other words, when you're numbered, when you're counted. To be counted means to be included, but to be counted means to be held responsible. That's such a fundamental theme of the Torah. You are commanded. Commanded being, it means you have an obligation. And failure to discharge the obligation results in God's punishment, in consequences. So, Pokod Yifkod Elohim Etchem, I'm embellishing what my friend said. But the fact of the matter is, there's a lot to this, both in terms of the whole experience. As Joseph comes to, at the end of his life, he understands we're all slaves. We're stuck here. We can't get out. And yes, this is part of God's plan. But why are we in Egypt in the first place? Well, because of the mistakes that were made in the past. And one of the big ones was the sale of Joseph and the animosity between Joseph and the brothers. So Joseph says, yes, we're all in God's hands. But let me tell you, there's a bumpy road ahead. Pakod Yifkod Elohim Etchem. I like this, I thought very, very much about Pakod Yifkod Elohim Etchem, because the word Pakad does mean that, both in the book of Shemot and in the book of Bamidbar. The count of the census in the beginning of Bamidbar, you're counting the people. But being counted means that being held responsible. The Levium are different. They're counted separately because they weren't involved with the golden calf. They have a different tafkid. Okay, they have a different tafkid to the different pikudim. But at the end of the day, you are held accountable. That's what Joseph says to his brothers. On the other hand, when we leave this place, just as Father Jacob imposed this oath upon me, I impose the oath upon you. It means that Yosef has understood what Yaakov taught him. Yaakov's mission was to go to Mitzrayim and to build a family in Egypt. The missing link is Joseph. Joseph the Egyptian, Joseph the viceroy. But that's Yaakov's mission, which he accepts. He goes down understanding fully well what it's about. Because he knows what it's about to be in Galus, because he already was in Galus, in the house of Lavan. It's the same experience. The same Gerus and Abdus and Inui. So he knows what he's getting into. He accepts it. He accepts it. He says, Hineni. This is the story. Let's take one more verse and I'll stop here. Vayomat Yosef ben Meyova Eser Shanim. Vayachantu oto. Vayisem Baron b'Mitzrayim. What a puzzle. Joseph died at 110. The Egyptians embalmed him and they placed him in a coffin in Egypt. So let me just let me make two comments about this verse. First of all, he dies at 110 years old. So I was reading recently, I don't remember where, that in Egypt, in ancient Egypt, we talk about 120. But in ancient Egypt, they talked about 110. You should live to 110. That was, and then Paro, when he sees Jacob so old, he's surprised. So 110, the claim is, I can't verify one way or the other, but the claim is that 110 was a full life for the Egyptian. If that be the case, then what the pasuk is saying, the last pasuk is emphasizing the Egyptian side of Joseph, which is not only does he live to 110, the Egyptian age, but he's also embalmed by Yachantu Oto. So he has an Egyptian burial. I would say something else, though. I don't know about the 110 and the Egyptians, but I do know about the pasuk in the beginning of Sefer Bereshit. God said, after the story of the Bnei Elohim in chapter 6, that the years of the human shall eventually maximum be 120. And if that is true, that the 120 is the full life, then living 110 has a different significance. Not that it's a full Egyptian life, but it's an incomplete Jewish life. And this leads me to the comment that was made earlier. I think it was Susie who made this point, which I'll pick up with. Joseph's work is not complete. Because had Joseph lived on, maybe the Chumash suggests, the Joseph that we encounter in the last verses of Sefer Bereshit is on the level of Moshe Rabbeinu. He understands exactly where they are. He understands the mission is to get them back to the land of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. He understands he's God's servant. He understands all of that. But he can't carry anything out. He understands. But he dies before his time. And then if that be the case, then the role of Moshe will be to carry on Joseph's work. It's what Joseph might have done. And I believe this theory is borne out when we look at Sefer Shemot and see the way the Chumash presents Moshe in conjunction with Yosef. That's point number one. Point number two, and I'll conclude with this thought, by Yisem Ba'aron ben Mitzrayim, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. So first of all, it's very striking that the last word of this book is Mitzrayim, book that starts with Gan Eden, and the last word is Mitzrayim. That's very striking. On the other hand, by Yisem Ba'aron ben Mitzrayim, he's placed in Aron. They translate coffin. Aron can be a coffin. Aron is something that actually later in Book of Shemot, the Aron is the ark that houses the tablets. And the point about the Aron in the Mishkan that the Chumash emphasizes, and so does the Tanakh, the Aron is the vessel that the staves of the Aron are always in the Aron. In other words, it's always ready to be moved. By Yisem Ba'aron b'Mitzrayim, says the Chumash, yes, he's in Mitzrayim, yes, he was embalmed, etc., etc. Yes, he says we can't get out, but he said something else. If you becomes a prophet over here, someday God will redeem us. And when God redeems us, I'm going, take me with you. And the fact that he's in an Aron means it's portable, it's movable. So even though the last word is Mitzrayim, but the word Aron gives us a hope that someday he will, in fact, be moved out of Mitzrayim, that his prophecy at the end of his life, that he fully understands his mission. He has to feed the people. On the other hand, part of this covenantal promise, starting with Abraham, Gerut and Avdut and Inu, and that's where we are. But someday God will take us out. The same God who says Gerut, Avdut and Inu, he says we're going to return. And I impose upon you the obligation in the name of God, Yeshua, to take me out with you. That's how this great book ends. Of course, the story will continue in the very continuation as V'yei Shemot, but you never really can finish the book of Bereshit because it's never ending. So we go back to it 100 times. All right, I'll stop at this point then. And next week we will start with Sefer Shemot, continuation of Sefer Bereshit. The relationship between them will deal with all that. Start a new book. Looking forward.
Thank you. And
all right.
Hazak when it's Hazak.
Yeah.
Okay. Very
Thank
good.
you.
Okay.
Thank you everyone who joined for today.
It's been a pleasure.
So Darabah.
Thank you.
All right then. Bye-bye.
All right. Just as we finish this, I want to highlight some upcoming classes at Drisha. Starting this week, we have 2 new classes. One on starting Tuesday, November 28th, 8 p.m. Eastern, which is Hanukkah, Holiday of Home Buddies with Rabbi Leah Sarna. Starting Wednesday night, November 29th at 8 p.m. Eastern is Technologies of Transmission with Rabbi Sarah Wolkenfeld. In addition to that, Drisha's annual Renee and Alexander Bohm Memorial Lecture is coming up in 1 week on Sunday, December 3rd at 7 p.m. Eastern. This year we have the pleasure of hearing Dr. David Shivitz speak on nature and the supernatural in medieval Ashkenaz. And with that, have a good day, everyone.